Hey everyone, I'm Florian, and today I'm going to talk a bit about OpenAI Rubik's Cube and solving robot. Mostly focus on the reinforcement learning part behind that, and I'm going to walk you through step by step what's happening there. So a little bit about my computer science PhD from the University of Munich. I did a postdoc at the University of Toronto for 2.5 years. I worked a total of, say, 10 years experience in ML, and 6 of those 10 years were in life science bioinformatics. And in my lifetime, I worked in, say, a lot of life science, and for a short time, I worked for a sales marketing company doing machine learning for, say, customer transactions. And currently, I work in finance. And today we're all here to talk about a Rubik cube solver. And some of people might have seen something like this before. So this is a Rubik cube solver. And you can see they can solve it within a fraction of a few seconds. This is from the MIT, and it's the world's fastest Rubik cube solver. But today, just a second. Today we're not about to talk about this one. So what we want to talk about is this one from OpenAI. And as you can see, there's a big difference between this and the other machine. So as you see, the OpenAI one is like a fully autonomous hand, and it can perform the actions or simulates a human hand solving the cube one-handedly. So I'm going to talk a bit about the reinforcement learning fundamentals, talk a bit about the core concept, the ideas we used, and you're going to see that a lot of the work I'm going to present today is from actually the previous paper, where they talk about how to build a dexterous hand that can turn and flip a cube. And I go step by step, I go through every step of reinforcement learning. I'm going to tell you, okay, what's the difference here for this Rubik cubes one. And we're going to talk about the results they published in the paper. I go a bit in detail about them. And after that, we're going to do a discussion. I have some nice discussion points, and there were also some discussion on social media about this project. So I have an example for that, so we can talk about that. So what was this kind of ambidextrous or learning dexterous hand? So this was this kind of hand, and what it can do, you give it a goal, right? You say, okay, I want a cube faced like this. And it learns by itself, just from cameras, to turn the cube in the right orientation. This is the task. This is what this hand can do. And it knows the goal at every step. So at every step, it knows what's my target goal position of that cube, and it keeps turning the cube. And as you can see, it kind of performs different actions on the cube. Like one is like it rotates the cube, and one it flips the cube. Now it just flips the cube, right? Now it's flipping the cube. And the other thing it learns is kind of to rotate the cube. And the way it works is, okay, we have 50 goals. It means 50 times you need to do it in the correct order. And once you reach 50 goals, the episode or the game has finished. And if you drop the cube, the game is finished. And if you take too long to achieve the goals or to achieve any goal, so you go from goal 48 to 49, you have a fixed time window. So if you take too long to achieve any goal, it will also finish the game. So most of you would know what's supervised learning, right? I have some type of data, and it says apples and bananas, right? And you know that apples are apples, and you know that bananas are bananas. And then you train some kind of model, and it will give you some separation rule, whatever, random forest, or say random forest has some rule set, or a support vector machine has some kind of hyperplane, separating hyperplane. So it has some kind of rule regulations to distinct apples from apples and bananas from bananas. And the other typical use case in machine learning is unsupervised machine learning. In unsupervised machine learning, you have some kind of unstructured data. So you have some data, some things you're fairly certain they're apple, and some things you're fairly certain they're banana, but you don't really know the true underlying labels for each individual in that data set. And then you train some model, and the model gives you some kind of relationship between these objects in your data. So it says you're going to put all the pet apples in all the apple basket, all the bananas in a banana basket, all the cats in a cat basket, and all the other things in the other basket. So what's the big difference to reinforcement learning, right? So in reinforcement learning, you have kind of two elements. One is the environment, and one is your agent. Your agent is kind of the machine learning agent, this kind of machine learning model. And this agent can interact with the environment. So see this hand, it can move the hand, right? So the environment would be kind of the cube inside of the hand, and the action can be I move my hand a little bit. And what happens is the robot sees the environment, it knows the state of the environment, and it says, okay, based on the state of the environment, I do this action. And then the environment says, okay, this is the next state. This is how the environment has changed, and this is the reward you get for your change. So concerning this, there are 4 fundamental concepts in reinforcement learning I want to talk today about, because they're important for understanding what's happening. I think you can add a few other things here to that list if you want to, but they're omitted for a reason. Because if you have noticed, it's a very long paper, and there needed to be a lot of pruning to done to fit it into the scope of this talk. So we're going to go through step by step. What is each element in this kind of reinforcement learning schema, and what is this element within this Rubik's Cube solving schema? So in general, action is basically a set of actions that are known that the agent can perform. Say in Super Mario, you can jump, or you can turn left, or you can turn right. In Grid World, like any game, think of any game, what you can do in poker. You can take a card, increase your bid, or we all played games. So think any kind of action you can do in a game is kind of your action set. And your action set is no. So the model knows all the actions it can do. So what they did here is, it's kind of you train this robot hand. And one way to think of it, this problem is, say, Mario goes left, or Mario goes right, or Mario jumps, right? It's just concrete yes or no states. But for this robot hand, it's like kind of like a continuous state. So it says, okay, your angle can be 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 10, whatever percent. Say angle of each of these servos, of each of these joints. And what they did is they tried a continuous one, and they tried a discretization, which means, okay, this joint can move, say, by up to 3%, and then they bin the 3% into 11 bins. And then you can say where the 11th bin, you move the whole 3%, and then 0 would be you just stay where you are. And all the actions in this hand is relative to your current position. So basically, all the actions is how much do you move your joint relative to the current position you are in. And you have 11 bins, and you have 3 joints. There's joint 1, joint 2, joint 3, and the fingertip. And that's basically your action space. You can move each of these elements by a certain percentage of your current position. And they tried a continuous one, but it worked worse than just spinning it. Is there any questions for the action space? So another big important part of any reinforcement learning problem is the reward. Like, what reward do I get from my action? And with reward, we mean like it's the immediate reward. So you do an action A, and you achieve something, and you get a reward. For example, you jump on top of a Goomba in Super Mario, you get some points. Or if your grid world is kind of like a checkered, like chess-shaped world where you can move on top, and if you touch a certain field, you move on a certain field, you get like a reward. And the second you jump on that field, you get this reward. And this reward is like immediately, directly after you perform the action. And this is one thing that was a bit controversial, people complained about. We're going to talk about this in discussion. But the Rubik's Cube, if you remember with the hand, it already knew it has a goal, right? Which was the goal to move the facet. And it's the same here. So essentially, the robot hand there is an algorithm called Kostimba's algorithm, which just gives you the correct order of moves to solve any Rubik's Cube. It's like the most fastest, efficient way. And what the robot sees is, oh, this is the next facet I need to achieve, I need to create. So the robot knows what the Rubik's Cube steps are. So it's not really what here in the paper they describe, they don't really describe this reinforcement learning agent knows how to solve a Rubik's Cube, but rather the reinforcement learning agent created a hand or learned a hand manipulation to solve a Rubik's Cube. But at each step, it knows what is the next step of the Rubik's Cube. So what the task is, the task at hand, is to turn and flip the cube in the right position, and then you rotate a face. And that's how they get the rewards in the system. So they say, if you move your cube closer to the final position you were, say your cube is not really properly adjusted, you just move it back to the next position and then you flip it. So each time you move it favorably in the correct position, they give you a small reward. And then when you achieve a goal, which means you flip or you turn, and then you twist it and you achieve, like, if you remember here, whenever you achieve a goal, in here it would be a Rubik's Cube instead. And sometimes you have to turn the face, and then they will give you the +5 reward. And if you drop the cube, they give you -20. And the way they differentiated it, they have some kind of sub-goals. So they say, okay, you can flip the cube, or now it's going to try to return the top counterwise. So the sub-goals is like you rotate a single face, like a face, you rotate a face by 90 degrees. And originally, they can say, oh, you can return any face. But in the end, it works best if you turn only the top face. So you see, one task is like you return the top face clockwise or counterclockwise. And one way is like you flip the cube or you spin the cube. And you can see, basically, what is missing is like some goal, if you remember, but I would be saying, okay, this is the position, the arrangement of the Rubik's Cube you want to create. Excuse me. Psst.
In the previous one, I'm a little confused. Why, like what you described sounded like an action. Why is that a sub-goal?
No, because the action is, oh, I move my joint by 1 degree. See, like, oops.
Talking about action, is action only one action? Like, I mean, movement of one joint in a certain degree, or can action be actually a sequence or vector of actions, like moving multiple joints?
Multiple joints.
Multiple joints. Okay.
So action, you see, each time he moves the finger, is an action. Each time he moves the hand, is an action, including like this joint as well. So this is all our actions. These are kind of the sub-goals. This is the things you need to achieve to get the Rubik's Cube in the right configuration.
So there are time steps as well, because you have joint movement, and this joint movement could take forever, right? But there are time steps, so you need to achieve a goal within a time step.
Yeah.
So as many joint movements you do.
Yes. So one action cannot result in one flip. So they say you have whatever 400 seconds to do a flip. So you have some time until you achieve a goal. So you can try multiple actions.
So just one question. So when we are rotating that particular phase, so when we are reward when at what time we are giving the reward. So when the colors are matching, or when the one cube is rotating at that time.
So there is some fixed algorithm how to solve this Rubik cube, and it's going to tell you what is the next step you need to achieve. So this is the next configuration of the Rubik's cube, and one step is like one rotation by 90 degrees, right? You take a face and you rotate it by 90 degrees. This is one step. And whenever you do one of these steps, and it's the correct step, you get 5 points. So you basically need to rotate the correct face clockwise or counterclockwise. But it only can rotate, it's easiest to rotate the top face. So what it needs to do, it needs to first rotate the cube that the face you need to rotate is on the top, and then you rotate the face. So face, say, is one row, right?
So what happens if the robot moves a face, like a wrong face? Is there any correction for like,
well,
do you know what I mean?
Well, you kind of get like here, you say kind of like difference between previous and goal state, right? So if you move away from your goal state, it will punish you.
I see.
What does dropping the cube mean? Is it totally drop out of the hand or slipped and fell in the palm?
Drop the hand, fell on the ground.
On the ground, then that should be like negative infinity. So
No, negative 20.
you cannot recover, right?
No, it shouldn't be negative infinity because you need to back propagate your arrows. Like kind of, we're gonna talk about the value function later, which kind of takes this kind of how should you look at the reward. So in a nutshell, what's the goal? So we have a certain action, and then you're in a certain state. And then it's basically what's your expected reward for a certain action in a certain state. This is kind of like your expected reward for an action. And this is what you want to maximize, your expected rewards for any. And we say, if you have, say, a trace, you play a game. You start at this 0, and then 1, 2, 3. Every round you play, you get a reward. Every action you do, you get a reward. Each time you move the finger a little bit, you get a reward. And what you do, you discount future rewards. Because you don't want something to happen that here you have 0, -1, and then maybe later down, 100 actions later, you have plus 1,000, right? And you don't want to say, okay, this kind of future rewards, you kind of discounted it. It is kind of, you put more weights on your immediate rewards, and you put a discount on the uncertainty of the future reward.
So here the discounting means that the robot actually learns the fastest way?
No.
No?
Discounting here just means that the robot
Disincentivized.
just to go for the immediate reward. So kind of you want, or say, in Q learning or in reinforcement learning, what you do this kind of reward discounting because you want to evaluate the value of a state. So in a nutshell, reinforcement learning wants to be in good states and avoid bad states. And how do you evaluate the value of a state? Which is kind of your current reward plus all the future expected rewards. And you kind of discount your future expected rewards because of the uncertainty. You're not certain you get this reward. And this is like a recursive way of looking at, like, oh, your current reward is basically or the next reward is basically your current plus the future discounted one. And the state is what you basically observe. So in a video game, it would be the video game screen. And as I mentioned, our goal is to find favorable states and avoid bad states. So what's the state here? So as I mentioned, you have kind of fingertip locations, and you kind of have the joint position, and you have the cube pose, and you have the facing angles. And later we're going to talk about this. So the model cannot see all of them at the same time, depending where if you're the actor or if you're the critic. And for the learning or for the simulation, they have kind of like the real world. Later they're going to run simulations with it. And what they do, they have how it is in reality, and then they add some noise. And the actor, he can only see the noisy information, whereas the critic can see both the noisy and the real information. And when you run the model in production, you actually don't use the critic, you use only the actor. But there's more, right? If you remember, there were some cameras installed. So they have 3 cameras looking at the cube. So this is still from the previous paper. They have the hand, and then they have 3 cameras facing the hand, and you can see the cube from 3 different positions. And the way it works, you have those 3 cameras, and you have some convolution. They use ResNet and other things, like some image classification, image layer, and then they pull it down to some dense layer, and then they say, okay, one part we make a neural network to predict the pose, and one we make to predict the angles, the face angles of this, basically.
Is it possible to point at the screen using your touchpad so that online people see? No? No.
No.
Never mind.
No. Sorry.
That's okay.
And if you put it like all together, this is a bit like how it works. So they have something they call a Geiger cube. And this Geiger cube has some electronics installed into the Rubik's cube, and it will tell you like the orientation and the velocity and everything, like all the forms, all the physical descriptor of the cube. It will tell you just like 100% correct digitally. And this is like either you use it for finding your face angles or you don't do it. This is kind of for the training and evaluation, depending what you want to train. And you have your cameras, and you just your convolution, and then you predict the pose and the face angles, and then you get the fingertips. And here what they write is LSTM. This is kind of the reinforcement learning agent in a nutshell. And then based on all these three information, it's going to decide the action, like which area to move the joints. And as you see the joints movements, you see the fingertips is always relative to your current position. So it's not like some absolute value, but always relative where you currently are. And this is how the vision neural network looks like, if you want to see. So it has the left camera, top camera, right camera, does convolution and pooling, makes a big layer, then has two fully connected layers, and then some 7 goes up for the position orientation, and then they have some for the axis, for the faces. So what's the value function? So the value function is a way to estimate the value of a certain state under a certain policy or random policy. So you're in a certain state, and you want to know how good is this state. And one way to describe it is saying, okay, the policy of the state and action is the future GT is a future discounted rewards giving of state and action. And you just sum it up. And as you said before, we can also write it recursively this way. In other words, it's kind of describing how good your current state are. So which is kind of your direct immediate reward plus your future discounted rewards. Let's say we play a game, right? And we are here like Mario, and we have two options. Either I can walk over, right into, or I jump over. And I say each time I move this amount of pixels right. You see here I'm that far away, and I move a few pixels closer, I get 10 points reward. So depending what you understood from what the state value function does, which one has a better value? Which of these two states has a higher value? The upper one, exactly. So the upper one has a higher value because they both give you the same rewards, but here your future rewards are very low because you're going to die. And here you're going to jump on top of the Cooper and then you continue. So are there any questions concerning value function, reward, action, state? Yes?
So the value, would that be the Q value then?
Yes. So if you do Q learning, you kind of try to estimate the action value or the state value. Like action state value function or the state value function. There are two types of value functions. Yes.
Can you please prove me wrong? Because I still think that discounting future rewards actually make the robot or computer to learn so bit faster. Because if you didn't discount it, it would mean that it would be doing something, but eventually it would get to the desired position. But while it's discounted, because it's discounted.
I think if you don't discount futures, it's a good chance that your model will not learn at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, but still I think like you are because in the end we are looking for the highest sequence of
I
rewards.
think we can talk about this more in discussion.
Yeah,
I would say technically you're right, but in reality, if you don't discount your future rewards, there's a good chance your model will not learn at all.
Yeah, I'm not saying not discounting. I know that we need to discount, but I thought that.
But I say technically, yeah, you're right.
Okay, yeah. I was just asking from the technical perspective.
Any other questions? So what we want is some type. We're going to talk about policy gradients, and this is like how the neural network comes into play. How the neural network does the kind of the decision making, which action. So the policy is kind of the set of actions the model does at a given state. And what you want, we have some state, we put it in our neural network or our model, and it points out some policy, some action. And one way to think of policy gradients is like, okay, we have some state features, and you have your hidden weight matrix, like say neural networks. You just have one layer neural network. And you multiply it, then you get your hidden state, right? And then you apply some softmax. So you get, and this hidden state is like number of actions. So you have input is number of features times number of actions, so your output is 1 times number of actions. In softmax, you get a probability for every action. And in a nutshell, this is your policy. So you say, okay, in this state, I'm 80% chance to do action A and 20% to do action B. And one way to do B on policy is you randomly draw from that distribution. So you just randomly draw and say, okay, with 80% chance I do action A. Any questions for that? So for most neural networks, you predict and you have your target, right? Say you do some kind of regression, you have like your mean squared error. And you take this mean squared error and you back propagate it, right? But now we have the problem is that how to optimize this neural network, right? Like what should we back propagate? And what we back propagate is like kind of the policy gradient. And this kind of, the cost function is defined as this, say, J from this parameter of my model, my neural network, right? And we say, okay, I want to do gradient ascent over my time, and say my previous gradient, like my model, time t is alpha, my reward on the point, or the reward of the series, times the policy gradient. So think of it, the error, say you do classification or you do root mean square error, kind of your error would be how close you are and how far you are away, and then you back propagate it, right? So this is kind of like this alpha g. Alpha is like the step size, and g is kind of like your direct error, right? And this is just the logarithmic, like the log bits of your policy. So we have the softmax, it gives you a probability for each action, and you take the logarithms as like log bits. Another way to think about the logarithm is like the derivative, you do a partial derivative of this logarithmic function. It's kind of like this derivative of this policy divided by the policy, right? So if you would solve the logarithm, you take the derivative of the logarithm. It's like chain rule. What it exactly means is like how much does the policy change or the policy gradient change in respect to the current policy. So kind of this is like your reward, and this is basically how much you should move. And alpha is your step size. And you backpropagate this in your neural network, yes?
Just confirm, step size is referring to a learning range, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, can you speak up and ask a question?
Okay, yeah, so the alpha is referring to the learning range.
Yeah. Alpha is learning rate or step size. Any other questions? So the cool method, one of the methods they used is called proximate policy optimization. So you have some policy gradient, right? This is what we just calculate this. You play a full game, and then you calculate your gradient from the whole game, and you backpropagated it. So what you get is like one big move in your neural network, one big move in your gradient. And now they say in proximate policy optimization, we want to do many small movements. And what they do, they just mini batch. You play a game, for every state, action, every step, what action you did, what is your reward. and you just randomly draw from these data points. And then you say, I take this mini batch and I calculate kind of the loss. Just you calculate this kind of in a nutshell. And you re-weight it with your policy. You do your batch normalization, and then first step is kind of the same, and see how much did it change from gradient to gradient step. So you do a gradient step, and you add this. You do this to kind of normalize your gradient, how big you move the gradient. And you can think of it a little bit of a L2 normalization, which means that each time I do a backpropagation step, you don't move too far away from the current policy. You just move a little bit. You just nudge into the right direction. So what you want to do is like many small steps towards the right policy. And so I said, okay, we just use this kind of rewards, future discounted rewards. But the problem is it doesn't take really into account the actual current value of the state. Say you're in a very favorable state, and whatever immediate action you do, you kind of get the same reward. Say you are here, you move up, you get +5. You move here, you get +5. So, and then you have whatever future rewards. So they say, okay, instead of taking the simple G, which is my reward plus my current reward plus my discounted future rewards, we subtract the expected value, so the value state of my current state. So idea is that you want your policies kind of evaluated to do better than random. Say if a random action in that state will give you this much reward, you want to do better. So it's kind of helps the model to train faster. And kind of, yeah. So actor-critic model is, you remember we're kind of predicting here the value of the state, or we're kind of using the average value of the state or whatever. You have some way to determine the value of the state. And in the actor-critic model, what we do, we have one value, like the actor, which is kind of predicting the policy gradients, kind of predicting the policy, and you evaluate, you optimize it with policy gradients. So it predicts the policy for a given state, and the output is like the number of actions. The output dimension is the number of actions. And then you have a second neural network, which takes all the information in, and it predicts the current state value, which just means the output is one dimension. And you kind of optimize them, like alternating. You optimize this one, and then you optimize this one, and then you do redraw your mini batch, and you kind of, yeah, and then they have also different loss functions. So how to go about with the actor-critic model, you kind of randomly initialize your policy, like both neural networks, like your policy neural network and your like your critic, like the value neural network, and then you start playing a game, you collect data, which is just state, action, reward, next state pairs. And then you calculate the policy. This is kind of the policy gradient updated. And you see, before we had the advantage value we had here. So we just used the critic to predict the advantage value, like the current value of the current state. And then for the policy itself, for the critic itself, you use just to this is used for Q-learning, and it's called like the temporal difference error. And you use this to optimize the critic to better predict the value of a state. So in a nutshell, this is like your current prediction of the state. And then you say, okay, a better prediction would be like the return plus the discounted of the next state, of your next state. It's kind of a better estimate than your current estimate. And you use this difference between this value and these values to kind of determine the temporal difference error. And this error is the one you backpropagate to your critic. So you have critic, and that will be your actor. Yeah.
Well, what you described as the training stage, in the rollout stage, is it true that only the policy network is used? The
Yes.
critic network is discarded?
Yes.
Okay. That's
So if you remember at the beginning, I said these are all the inputs, right? And some inputs are only available in simulation, right? So this is like kind of the true observations. And the critic model sees everything. It sees the inputs available only in simulation and the inputs available to the real robot, which is kind of like the noisy observations. And the goal would be like the next step of the Rubik's cube solving algorithm. And the critic predicts like the value of the function, and the actor predicts the actions. So we have, we have 5 joints, 11 bins, 3 joints plus finger, right? And 5 fingers. So 5 fingers, 4 measurements per finger, makes 20, and we have 11 bins for every measurement. So output is like all the next movements from all the fingers, right? According to bins. Any questions? I have some lag.
Follow up my previous question. You told us that the critic network was discarded. But is there a case, apart from Q-learning, where the critic network is also used in rollout?
Yes. It's called deep deterministic policy gradients. So the critic can also evaluate the state and the action, not only the state.
I see.
Or the action, the actor, right, can get past like the state plus the estimated value of the state and other things, right? I have some.
And is there a use case for that kind of architecture?
Yes.
And so what kind of use case would that be?
They use it for all kinds of things. Continuous control, playing games. So you remember DeepMind? They had this kind of Atari playing robot, and then they had another robot playing more complicated games. This was deep deterministic policy gradients. So the deep deterministic policy gradients, they are used for continuous control problems. I have no idea what's happening.
With the rest of the presentation? Are you ready, Eddie?
You're missing the opportunity to have product placement in the YouTube videos. Hi, okay, welcome back, everybody. So this is what the neural network architecture looks like for the actor and for the critic. And this is again what the whole architecture of the reinforcement learning agent looks, or of this robot looks. And the big question is like, how do we train these type of robots? And what they did, you train it in a simulation, and then you take the simulation to the real world. And this process is called sim to real. And how well you perform from simulation to reality is one of the evaluation criteria. And what they did is they have a simulation, and they trained the vision and the reinforcement learning separately. So the reinforcement learning agent gets like fingertip positions and whatever, and you can like add noise to it or whatever. And this vision part gets some images feed from your simulation and creates the cube pose and the face angles. Other questions? And what can you simulate? So you simulate physics like the geometry, friction, gravity, size of the cube. Visual, okay, you can modify the vision, you can rotate, you can add color, filter, or whatever. Observation, what you can modify in observation is like you make noisy the location of the fingertips or the location of the joints. Or what you also can do, you can jam a joint and break a joint or whatever. And they also have something is kind of like random network adversary, which means they add just some random network noise. So one time you pass the action is just some random network noise action. And classical domain randomization is you have some kind of fixed schedule or have some fixed rules, and it will apply to your images. And what it does, it takes the image, and here is just one way of doing this domain randomization. And you just add like different color filters. No, this is domain randomization.
Yeah, fixed domain randomization.
Yeah, it's fixed, yes. And here the biggest contribution for the paper, or of this paper, was a method they called automatic domain randomization. And what they do is, as you see, like for the vision, for the filter, for the joints or whatever, each of your random noise has some type of hyperparameters which kind of controls what type of noise is added to your model. And this automatic domain randomization kind of controls the level of randomness. And automatic domain randomization, what it does, it starts with low level of noise, and then over time it increases the level of noise, making the task more difficult. And the speed at which the noise gets increased or decreased is dependent on the model performance. So model starts with very low noise, a very easy problem, and it learns the problem, and then you increase the noise and make the problem more difficult. So the idea is if you just do fixed random noise, at the very beginning it's going to be very difficult for the model to learn because it's overwhelmed with the noise. So at the beginning you give him a non-noisy environment, and it can learn the actions appropriately. And this is what the ADR algorithm looks like. So say this is the initial parameter values. And this is the upper and lower bounds for each dimension. So you have a hyperparameter, and you have 10 parameters. So it gives for each dimension, for each hyperparameter, upper and lower bound. And it's just uniformly randomly created, upper and lower bounds. And you have some kind of threshold for lower and threshold for higher. And M is like the number of trials. And you start with a random model. Lambda is like you just draw, for create your randomness, you just draw some kind of random permutation. And what you do, you draw I, it means you select one of those dimensions, you select one of those dimensions. And you select x, it's uniform between 0 and 1, and if x is less than 5, you fix the lambda I at the sufficient. You select a random dimension in that vector, and with less than 50% probability, you fix it, make this lambda I fixed to the lower bound. And otherwise, you fix this lambda I to the upper bound. You just change it. Whatever you draw, a random model, you just override it with the upper or lower bound. So what happens is one dimension is fixed, and the other ones, they can change. And then you just evaluate the performance of your model, and you add this performance to kind of your buffer. So this is, this is the performance data buffers. So basically, you fix your performance, you calculate how well you did, and for this, say if you're lower or higher, you just add it to the performance buffer. Oh, no. Oh. Yeah, exactly. And if you have enough trials, you calculate the average performance of that buffer. You clear it, and they say if it's doing better than a certain threshold, you increase the noise on that dimension, or you decrease the noise on that dimension if it does worse than a certain point. So what you do here, exactly. So this is just some random value you started, and you add the lower higher bound, and these are the replay buffers. So basically, each time you fix a dimension, you run it, and then you store it in the appropriate buffer. Like for the buffer for that dimension, you store the performance.
And the idea when you check it against the upper and lower thresholds, if the performance is above the threshold, meaning that the model has adapted to the current randomization significantly, then you increase the amount of randomization. And if it's gotten worse, then you decrease. That's what the plus or minus delta is, given those TH is the higher threshold, TL is the lower threshold.
Yes. just to give you like a visualization what it looks like. So at the beginning you have like node, and as the model continues, it can just increase the upper and lower bounds. So it can be very small or very big, and then you can just draw somewhere in between.
Questions about? Wait, so that was the size of the cube? Was that?
There's one thing you can manipulate is the size of the cube. Is there any questions for ADR? So there's a way how to kind of simulate or train the simulations, or create the simulation. Say it's a method how to create the simulation. So you have kind of like a training protocol, and instead of having some fixed set of rules, it's adaptive based on the performance of your model, which allows the model to better learn. So
Did you talk about how the simulation is used?
So the simulation is used to train the model. So the actor-critic model runs a simulation and plays the game. It solves the Rubik cubes. And where was it? So here, you do it one time. You just train the actor-critic model with your simulation. You just create your simulations. And the other time you train your vision model. You train it just separately. Any questions for the methods part?
Do you want to talk about the points of randomization, the degrees that the things that they adjusted?
Oh, I didn't write it down. They have like a lot of stuff they did.
Yeah.
And there were like vision stuff. Like I've listed the categories, right? So they have like kind of physical. They change the friction of the cube. Like cube can be very slippery. They changed the gravity of the cube. Like the gravity can be heavier. And what they also changed a little bit, the geometry is like the size of the cube. And what they changed is, they did it in the physical world. I don't know how exactly they did it in the simulation, but sometimes they have like they put on a glove, which would be kind of the friction of moving the joints. And in real world, they put on a glove and they tied certain fingers together. I think this is what they also did in the simulation. They must have done it in the simulation. So.
Yeah, the idea is for each of these different parameters, as they increase the amount of randomization for each of them, the whole network is becoming more robust to different environments. So whereas in simulation it might not matter so much, it's critical for the transfer to the real hand to be able to adapt to different environments, different scenarios. And so these are the sort of degrees of freedom by which they try to make themselves robust too. Yeah.
Is the ultimate goal to increase the generalizability of the trained model?
The ultimate goal is to increase the ability to transfer to the real world scenario. So yeah, I don't know if I think they use the word generalizability. There's some discussion on that.
Okay.
I think ultimately the goal is what Gordon says is the primary goal. Like you want to be as good as possible when transferring to simulation to the real world, but alternatively they don't want the model to overfit. So by doing this kind of randomization stuff, it kind of learns to deal with different things at the same time. So say you run the cube in real life, and something is a little bit off, and you never trained for all the noisy stuff. Like, say the observations are made noisy, like which is the real position of your fingers, right? So the model kind of learns to deal with noisy positions, right? And later you use the cameras and look at the fingers, right? So your input of your finger gonna be very noisy. So they kind of already simulate this noise in the simulation. So the reinforcement learning agent knows how to correct for it.
So I don't remember if you mentioned that. Are there sensors in the fingers, or is the only input about the location of the hand through the cameras.
The way there are, I have to check it again. I think there are pressure sensors in the fingers,
They had
right?
a few different setups that they worked with. So they tried doing it with just cameras, I believe. There were different cubes, as Florian mentioned. So one of the cubes actually would transmit constantly the position and orientation of the cube. It's called Gilker cube.
It seems they don't have any additional sensors in the hand, except this.
I don't think
From this
so.
list?
I don't think so.
Well, they had something with some resistors in the picture.
I have to check. I think there is some automatic, some embedded sensors and stuff for keeping track of those, but they use different setups too.
Yeah,
I have to double check.
So they have sensors to measure the position of the joint angle, and they describe how they do it with some resistors and other things. But I believe this is not accessible to the neural network. The neural network just knows the position, the angle of the joint, at least according to this table.
And as far as I remember, they also manipulated the cube. So the cube that doesn't have the sensors, the one that's not this Gilker cube, they still did put a marker on each of the center squares cubes of each face. So each face was a distinct face, or each center cube was distinct. It wasn't a fully stateless.
So they did a lot of experimentation with the cube. Like Gordon said, they have the cube just empty as it is, just a normal Rubik's cube, and I have something what we call Gilger cube. So this is like a high-end cube, and the cube has kind of Bluetooth connection, and it tells you the position of the cube and everything. And then they had also different cubes. They changed what the cube, so they put markers on the cube, so from the image you can refer the orientation of the cube. So because of the cube, if you take a normal Rubik's cube, you can kind of, if you look only at the top or you look at two sides, you kind of can rotate it, right? You wouldn't know what just the rotation is. And what they did, they take, see here the Rubik's cube, they cut out like a small black square here in the Rubik cube. And this way you know the orientation of the face. Any other questions? Yes?
Well, I'm kind of interested in one of the reference, the asymmetric actor prediction. If I understood correctly, the idea is that the critic network use the accurate data and the policy network use the noisy data.
Here in this paper?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's one of the reference.
So the critic uses the noisy data and the non-noisy data.
Sorry, critic use the non-noisy data, and policy use the noisy data.
Yes.
So have they tested the actual performance in the simulator when the actual data becomes basically have they measured the impact of actual data on the final performance?
What do you mean by actual data?
In simulation, if they also use the accurate data by somehow fusing the result of policy network with the value network, does it give better performance?
When you take the model from simulation to real world, you use only the actor model.
Yes.
You don't use the critic. The
Yes.
critic you use only in training. And training was done only in the simulation,
Yes.
not in the real world.
My question is that, if that accurate data actually has any value to be used in real world, assuming that it is available. The reason I'm asking is because in real world, sometimes the robot needs to deal with temporarily disabled sensor. For example, sometimes suddenly one camera was
I
blocked.
think we can talk about this in the discussion part. It
Okay.
seems to be a comparative question. Just
Okay.
for fun. Are there any questions to the methods part? So, a little bit of the results. So the robot can solve Rubik's cubes. Congratulations. Now we can go home. And they tried different things to mess with the robot. Here they put on a rubber glove to increase like the friction of moving the joints. And you can see he's gonna solve it any minute now, any second now. And they tied fingers together. This is what the other thing they did. And it's gonna solve it now. It's turning the wrong direction. Hope you. No, it tries to turn it back. Oh, with the power of photo edit, video editing. And they put like a blanket on top to obfuscate the vision. And I don't know how long it would work if you obfuscate it permanently, right? At one point it stops, right? I guess you can obfuscate it for a few seconds. And then they put the plush giraffe to mess with it.
It is de-giraffified.
It's giraffe-proofed method. And yeah, they mess with it with a pen. One dexterous hand.
It's a very persistent solver.
Yeah, he doesn't give up, right?
Like I want PhD students like this.
Solving Rubik's cubes all day. It's already doing that.
Very persistent.
Anyway,
Only if I had this much perseverance.
No.
I think it's too much free will preventing us. And what they did is they kind of say, okay, how is this sim to sim transfer performance? Like you run a simulation, you transfer in another simulation, and you increase the randomization level. So as the training continues, you have more noisy, but the model performs well, and then you add the noise, and it doesn't affect your performance anymore. And they have like different schedules, and say you have domain randomization on ADR, and see the domain randomization has kind of fixed level of noise, right? And then depending how much noise you have, like the bigger the number, the more entropy noise you have, the more noisy it is. So you have very big one. See here, the XL fixed, it really prevents the training to do really well because it's just too noisy at the beginning. And if you have it really low, it also prevents to train really appropriately. So this is already much higher. This time interval, it's already much higher than here at this interval, where it's like almost no noise, right? And you see the ADR outperforms all the other fixed DRs. I think I'm just going to show evaluation on reinforcement learning. What they did, the ADR can just as well be used for only the vision part. But here, just for time constraints, I think I'm already far above my use. So this is kind of how well it performed and different levels of ADR. I think ADR here, small, medium, large, XL, and XXL refers to a bit like to training time. You train longer. And the other thing is how the IDR entropy, like how many dimension, how much IDR entropy you allow, like how long the schedule goes. And XL is the longest, and they perform the best performance. So what they run 100 simulation, and this is kind of like the number of successful turns, like how many goals you can reach up to 50 goals. So this is like the average number of goals you achieved, and this would be 46 for the simulation, and 32 for the real world. In the real world, I did 10 runs. So 10, you can reach up to 50, so it would be 500. So on average, they make 32 correct turns.
Just to give an idea of the training time, the ADR XXL, which is the which took the most time, they ran it for several months. So
They said 13,000 hours. No?
yeah.
Something like, or 13,000 years of experience.
Years.
Yeah. Yeah. The hardware was pretty impressive. It was like 32 CPUs per machine and 900 or 800 machines, and then the GPUs were I can't remember right now, but not small hardware, and they ran it for a long time. Yeah.
So I can't run it on my phone.
They didn't have the phone patch yet, actually. It's coming in 10 years.
So, yeah. And then they did something they called like emergent meta learning. And what they refer here is, if you remember, we had the neural network, and the last part was a LSTM, right? So the idea is this kind of hidden state of the LSTM and the hidden state before, they kind of need to encode something, right? They kind of need to encode the current state of the environment. Things like gravity, friction, position, yada, yada, yada. And they want to say, okay, how can we evaluate if this is true? And they would say, if this kind of hidden state, this 1,000 dimensions or 2,000 dimensions, have actually a real meaning, then it's kind of emergent, because we didn't tell the neural network, oh, this should mean friction, or this should mean whatever. And they did multiple things. One, they trained the model, and after its first 50 successful runs, so they changed the system. They changed the hidden state, they reset the hidden state of a neural network, or they resample, suddenly change the environment very drastically, or they break a random joint. So the idea here is I have my model trained, and it's not overfitted, and it's actually generally really learning the environment. It's generally learning the environment in its hidden states. So if I change the system, then it should not affect the model as drastically, because it was not just simply overfitting, but actually learning the environment, trying to capture the environment. Is that clear? Okay, good questions. So what they did is, it's kind of time to completion. Like, how long does it take for phase to complete a phase? Like one go. And what they do after 10, they change the model, and it like spikes up, but it very quickly learns. You see here, it learns like this speed, and here it learns at this speed. And it kind of stays consistent if they try it again. This was reset to hidden state, and here they resample the environment, and they get like similar performance. So they kind of drastically change the environment, and it just performs. Here what they did, they break a joint, and what they see is like the baseline is just the model, and then here they break the joint, right? And it kind of stays a bit worse than the model that had a broken joint from the very beginning. And they argue, yeah, because the model is learning something related to this joint, and then suddenly it's gone, and it's kind of overfit and cannot unlearn it. Or not overfit, but it cannot unlearn having that joint. Or rather, let me see.
I think they argued the other way, that the model that starts with a broken joint from the baseline is maybe learning from the beginning how to adapt to not having that joint.
Yeah.
And so if you break the joint mid-training, it doesn't ever get quite as good. Like the yellow line never comes quite as low as the green line.
Yeah.
But it's quite close.
It's comparable. Yeah. I think, either way you look at it.
Same.
If you chop my finger off, I don't think I'd ever be as good as someone who was born with 4 fingers.
Oh yeah.
Well, actually, this shows that the broken joint baseline, that the green line shows that, this problem with a robotic hand without a joint, with a broken joint, you cannot do that. So you cannot do that as well. So yeah.
Yeah.
So you have to compare with the baseline, with the broken joint baseline, basically, which is the green line.
Yeah, which is like
So the model
slightly
hasn't
better.
done really so poorly.
It's not like it's overfit so much to the scenario of having 5 fingers that it can't perform as well as, or close to as well as something that started with 4.
I mean, it's not really statistically different.
Yeah. Well, it is considered. It's consistently doing worse, right?
But I mean, look at the error bars, and they're mostly overlapping.
Well, they're not overlapping here. They're mostly none of them.
There would have to be some systematic error in order for it to be.
Yeah, I mean,
I think it's just.
it's almost the same.
I feel like they just. What is meta learning? Like there's things like emergent behavior, which means the robot learns certain actions to do which you haven't programmed to do it. And one of the action was the robot holds it, like kind of pinches the cube and then use gravitational power for it to rotate. And this is what it learned. And this is like clear, you can see, right? There's a kind of emergent behavior. This I feel is like we mess with the system and then we see how well we do. So the robot is already trained for a changing environment, and then suddenly I change the environment stronger, and then it just learns adaptively. Like it just your ADR trains for a changing environment, and then you change the environment, and it learns again. So I don't know what to take out of this. I think the one we're gonna talk about now, I think is more interesting. So what they did is. Remember at the end we had the LSTM, and the LSTM has like a hidden state and a cell state. And what they did, they add the hidden and the cell states together to create some kind of hidden state. And then they take a 64 neuron single layer with a ReLU, and we put this hidden state from the LSTM as the input. And we use this to predict, say, is this a real world, a real value, or is this a modified value, right? This was the first one. They predict if the observation is a real observation or a noisy observation. And this is like how long they're trained, how well they do. And they achieve like, say for cube size and for time step, they get like 80% accuracy. And for gravity and cube mass, they get like 60% accuracy very quickly. So given the hidden state, from this LSTM, they can accurately predict, oh, is this like a noisy value or a real value? And the other thing they did is they binned the values, right? And then you had to predict the gravity value or whatever value given from the hidden state. And then they calculated cross entropy, and you see, okay, your model trains, and you can reconstruct this kind of hyperparameter given the hidden state from the LSTM. So the LSTM kind of encodes gravity or resistance or friction or whatever, timestamp and size. Is there any questions for the results? I'm going to take a short break or just go with current discussion? Okay. So there was one person complaining, and it's clear in the paper, and Gordon mentioned it as well. So how it was reported, or how the title of this paper, it kind of says, oh, it's a Rubik's Cube solving roboter, which is, it kind of is, but the real reinforcement learning part has nothing to do with solving, actually generally solving the Rubik's Cube, but rather solving the dexterity action, like the hand motion and hand action required to solve the Rubik's Cube.
You're saying that because the solution was given
to
them.
So how many people here, when they read maybe the title and abstract, thought that the work had to do with actually
Rubik's
the algorithm to solve.
Yeah.
That's
For
really
most people, yeah. I think that this criticism is fair in that regard, that the title is misleading, because even if you know it's reinforcement learning, it's reasonable to assume that reinforcement learning is being applied to solving. And the argument here is, especially if you're a non-technical audience, then it's going to be even more confusing. There were some criticisms that I think were a bit unwarranted here, or stretched too far.
But I think it was intentional, the title.
Yeah, I think that's what Florian's title is saying, right?
It's
It's,
a
uh,
clickbaity title, like, what would you?
Well, one way they should pay their HR team, because it captures a lot of people, but at the same time it causes also some backslash, so maybe they shouldn't pay. I guess it's every's own discretion to say if it's worth it. If you're a business, you also want to have people like trust you to some degree.
what's the feeling in the room? How do you guys feel now, knowing what it's about? How do you feel about the title? It's
I
fine.
mean, solving is a vague term. So, I mean, what does solving mean?
No, apart from this controversy, because it is brought about a lot of controversial stuff. But apart from that, how do you feel now that you know? Do you think it's still impressive the way that you've handled all those
Sure.
the ADR algorithm? Do you find it still impressive?
Yeah.
I think so. Like one of the biggest challenges that doing reinforcement learning in real life has is how to transfer the theoretical knowledge to an actual physical robot. Like that's one of the, like you're talking to folks at Kindred, and that's one of the biggest problems that they usually have to tackle when they're building their robotic arms. And it sounds like these guys have an interesting approach to tackle that.
I actually like how it looks naturally how the hand moves. So I never tried to manipulate the Rubik cube by one hand, but I was trying to mimic what I would be doing, and it seems that it quite mimics human hand well.
Part of that has to go to the manufacturer. They didn't create this robotic hand. They use it. I think it's Shadow is the company, or the product is the Shadow something.
I think I agree what Amir said. If you use ADR, if you use ADR, it's going to be really good if you do robotic stuff. I don't know how well it's transferable to other fields. Say you do ADR, can be transferred to any field of machine learning where you do a randomized, like DR, domain randomization, right? But domain randomization cannot be used in every field. So there are domain randomization methods for NLP problems and for vision. There are a lot. But say if you have your own custom supervised machine learning problem, you cannot. It's sometimes not that straightforward to do your own randomization. So
I guess there is also something to be discussed, which is probably solving the whole problem, like the status space will be ridiculously large, and it probably makes sense to divide the ultimate goal to sub-goals, and then at each episode or whatever you call it, try to achieve one specific sub-goals, and then concat them. In a future paper, they might, since they have this, they can start from this and train to even, go for the ultimate goal rather than the sub-goals.
well, in the paper they say they could have made a reinforcement learning algorithm that can do the whole thing and can do also the, keep track of the precision of the cube without any help. But then you need to have some kind of memory and look back, okay, what were the past positions of the cube? And I said, theoretically, they can do it, but it just takes a long time to train, right?
Yeah.
So I think the second ADR is just how to do it distributed, right? So for ADR, Well, you can kind of compare it to exploration in that sense that you first have like a set rules which you learn, and then if you feel comfortable, you move on. So this is what I meant for ADR. It's like if there's a domain randomization method already in the literature, you can apply ADR for it. So the question is, what kind of parameters are difficult for randomization in an ADR environment in general? Which parameters is the most challenging for randomization in the context of present work? How promising is the work in a closer look? How far away are we from fully autonomous, very intelligent agents? What are the limitations? I think we talked a little bit about this at the beginning. So also when we were talking about what was the expectations. So anyone wants to talk more about this topic? I'm fine.
So I have more like a philosophical comment. I don't know a human being who would naturally do a Rubik's Cube on one hand. It's just not natural for us. The irony is that for a human being, using two hands it's much easier, while for the robot, if you use two hands, it exponentially multiplies your state space and it's so much harder. All your 11 positions and 3 joints and 5 fingers, and you cannot multiply that by 2, you have to square that because you have to do like a cross product. And so it seems to me that the primary goal is to mimic through a robotic hand what we as humans are able to do with the human range of motions. However, this is still very unnatural to me because I would not even hold a Rubik Cube and try to flip it weirdly in just one hand and spin it. I would just do it with 2 hands.
There are people who solving Rubik's Cubes with one hand is a competition.
Yeah,
And
so it is a thing then.
It is a thing, very much, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting point. If you added a second hand, what would that do? And I think it would certainly make it more complex, as you suggested, but I don't think it's unreasonable to think in the future that it could make it faster as well as computation gets better and models get better.
If you do a second hand, ultimately even have your Rubik's Cubes in, it's like what Amir said before, you break it up, right? So you have Rubik's Cubes in hand 1, so you're going to do something. And then you enter the state where you do grasping. So you take your other, in that state where you do Rubik's Cube in hand 1, you just move hand 1, right? You don't move with both of your hands at the same time that much. And then you do grasping, and then you're in the rotation where you move both hands. But you see, each time humans do a hand motion, it's like complicated that you can not just do arbitrary movements of both hands in whatever directions, right? There's some kind of limitations, like you do this kind of twists and turns, right? And the ultimate goal, I believe, is that you pick up a tool or you do something and the robot just watches you doing it. Like you pick up a tool and you tight the screw. And then you have a robot arm and it's going to pick up the screw and tight the screw. And then you put the robot arm on an assembly line and then you're just going to check on that robot once in a week, maybe, or once in a day and that's it. I think OpenAI is like from Elon Musk, and his goal was this kind of fully automated car assembly line, and that's why I believe they do a lot of this type of stuff, because this is the biggest challenge, just do manual labor work things. A lot of things that require human dexterity, right? And there's a lot of noise and randomization happening, right? It's maybe some pieces at the wrong spot or whatever. And a human can deal with it, but a machine, not that much. The claim is that improved prediction of environmental parameters is a measure for meta-learning. To what extent is this true? I think it's just how you define meta-learning. If you say, they said we define meta-learning as capturing kind of the state, and the state in that sense beyond just the position and the angles of the cube in the face, but rather the state, what are the rules of the state, like what's the friction, what's the gravity, then I would say predicting these kind of parameters is actually a good way of measuring meta-learning. If you say meta-learning in the sense of transfer learning, or you do task 1 and how well you can do task 2, I think it's still an indicator, but not as strong of an indicator. Like, it's still a strong indicator because it implies that your model can learn the higher abstract concepts of the problem. It's just a question, oh, it was done for a Rubik's Cube. Let's say it should pick up a hammer and hammer a nail. If I run it in simulation, can it do it the same? You can argue yes, but you can also argue no in that case. Whereas in the prior case, and their very specific definition of meta-learning, I would say it's a clear yes.
What was their definition of meta-learning again? It was learning something that it wasn't programmed to learn.
It was very concrete written, like, oh, it learns the true transition probabilities, which means it learns kind of the real world rule system, right?
Yeah, they explicitly say, when we say meta-learning, what we really mean is learning to learn about the environment dynamics.
Yeah.
Within other communities, this is so-called online system identification. So
they validate that through the ability to adapt to different perturbations and things like that, I guess.
Well, I guess to say it, differently, it is probably, I guess, to rephrase what you just read, it is the fact that the algo is actually learning the environment rather than overfitting to one specific data set to train on. Like when you remove a finger, it hasn't been exposed to that at all, but that's a new environment now. And it learns as if from scratch it didn't have that finger almost. Within the bars.
I'm curious about what Florian said earlier, which I thought was interesting, which is you train, the whole idea of ADR is that you're varying the environment space in simulation. And then in practice, you vary the environment and you say, oh, wow, it learned that on its own. But Florian's point was, isn't that what you were doing in simulation in the first point? Weren't you already varying? Maybe the argument is that the way that they varied things at inference was different than how they varied things in training. What do you think?
I think it's like my concern is it's learning this kind of permutations is the goal of this whole pipeline, right? It just at one point it's cranked to 2, and then at one point I crank it to 11, and then I crank it back to 2. Then I don't know how much it is representative of whatever they want to show. Because this is exactly, dealing with this problem is exactly what this whole pipeline is designed to do. So from all the problems you can throw at it, it's the easiest one.
Well, I could agree with you for one of those permutations, which is to resample the environment. But how do you justify they just get rid of the hidden state values? I mean,
because that was not something that they would randomize, right? Yeah, that's a good point.
That's a good point, yeah. I think the hidden state values is a good thing. It's kind of, but you see, at the very beginning of the training, all the hidden states are random, right? And then you optimize. And look at how many layers this whole model has, right? And then suddenly, one of these layers you make random, and all the other ones stayed trained. Of course, you're going to learn faster. You only have to learn one layer. You don't have to relearn all of the layers. If you look at it this way, right? Yeah. At the very beginning, they say, oh, this is how we did at the very beginning. And then we randomize one of our 100 layers or whatever. And then suddenly, oh, it takes us faster to learn this one layer than all those 100 layers. Kind of, yes, right? I don't know. Maybe they say you didn't overfit, right? If you overfit all your layers and you kill one layer, right? Then maybe if the model is super overfit, everything else behind comes noise. But even if everything behind comes noise,
so it's definitely
look how the gradient works, right? This is how gradient works. You have your error and you backpropagate it. And each of the error for the weight is basically the weight, the error caused by this weight. So basically the error caused by the trained layer is going to be very low, whereas the gradient for the random layer is going to be very big. And naturally the random layer is going to learn faster.
So it's hard to argue that their model is not robust, but there is an argument of whether or not it's meta learning.
It's robust, but it's robust, and this is what they trained for, to be robust. And what they showed is they are robust.
So they're robust.
Yeah, they're robust.
So you're good.
The question is if it was meta-learning, right? That's the question. I would totally agree they're robust, right? You can throw a blanket on it or have
Plus
a
giraffe
test.
I mean,
Giraffe perturbation.
would it be like, what is our definition, I guess, right? So if in the simulation it is never exposed to a giraffe, and now in real life you're exposing it to a giraffe, but it's still robust against that perturbation, would that be meta-learning?
It would be interesting if you took out one of the degrees of randomization in simulation, like almost like an ablation study, right? You don't allow it to randomize a certain parameter of the environment, and then you test how robust
So
it is.
that's
to
exactly
that.
what I mean, right?
But I don't know if the giraffe test is.
Giraffe was a joke, but
This is
but
exactly
essentially
what they did.
that's my point. Like if there is something that you didn't provide, a perturbation
Yeah.
that you didn't, like if removing a finger was not something that it was exposed during the simulation, but in real life you did it and it behaved the way you wanted.
So they might have done that, I'm not sure, but they definitely didn't call it out. They didn't say, we purposefully didn't randomize this and then tested that.
Right.
They
Correct me if
randomize
I'm wrong.
an ADR, you randomize everything, and then you keep one fixed. Right? This is the one which you replace with the lower or the upper bound.
That
So each
includes,
randomly,
that includes breaking a joint.
I don't think it includes breaking the joint.
Okay, so maybe breaking joint was the ablation test you referred to.
Maybe, yeah.
I mean that would be impressive.
I'm
But
not sure
they
actually
didn't-
right now, because they have a baseline for the broken joint. I think at this point it's just speculations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, as a criticism, the parts of the paper have not been really well written. There are a lot of details that you would need to understand what is going on fully. But as a preprint, I mean, we cannot expect more. So.
Do you have more discussion points?
No, that's it.
All right.
Thanks you for your attention. Good time.